Christa Bramlet. In 1996, 23-year-old Christa Bramlet lived in New Providence, Tennessee. Struggling financially, she resided in a mobile home, while her 2 young children had moved to live with her mother in Corpus Christi, Texas. Christa remained behind, hoping to finish her GED program. However, the area surrounding her home had become increasingly unsafe, plagued by rising crime rates, including burglaries and drug-related offenses. Sadly, Christa became one of the many victims of the community's worsening troubles. On the afternoon of October 28, 1996, her landlord knocked on the door of her mobile home in Sunnydale Mobile Home Park, located just off Peachers Mill Road. When there was no answer, the landlord grew concerned and decided to check inside. It was there that he discovered Christa's body. She had sustained injuries to her throat, and the autopsy revealed that she had been suffocated. Additionally, it was determined that she had been indecently assaulted. Investigators collected male DNA from her body and sent it to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation's lab to create a DNA profile. The DNA profile was submitted into the combined DNA index system, but no matches could be made. Investigators were only able to confirm that the DNA belonged to a black male. Without any other leads in the case, investigators could not identify the culprit, and the case went cold. It was only on February 13, 2019 that the Clarksville Police Department detective, Michael Uray, got the news he was waiting for. The DNA in the combined DNA index system matched a man who was living in Phoenix, Arizona. The man is 48-year-old Kenneth Hudspeth. Hudspeth had never come up in the investigation up to this point, and he was on nobody's radar. In April of 2019, Detective Uray interviewed Hudspeth and discovered that he was indeed in Clarksville at the time Christa's life was taken. He moved away from the area in December of 1997. Hudspeth admitted that he knew Christa and said he was the last person to see her alive. As a result of the DNA evidence and this interview, Hudspeth was arrested and charged in connection with the case. Investigators also took a look at Hudspeth's arrest record. They could see that he had been arrested several times on charges like domestic assault and felony assault. He has spent time in Arizona and Texas prisons. This brings up the question, why wasn't his DNA collected years ago? In June 2019, Hudspeth made his first appearance in Montgomery County Court in connection with the charges against him. The case went to trial in September 2021. During the trial, half of a 3-hour interview conducted by Detective Uray with Hudspeth was shown to the jury. Hudspeth admitted that he had been using drugs at the time and could not recall whether he had assaulted or killed Christa, but he expressed hope that he had not done so. It was also revealed that Hudspeth's DNA was found on Christa's body, on her bra, and on 2 cigarette butts collected from the scene. After 4 days of testimony, Kenneth Hudspeth was found guilty of all charges on September 24, 2021. In January 2022, at 51 years old, Hudspeth was sentenced to life in prison, with an additional 20 years for his crimes. Before I continue, I want to remind you that only a small percentage of people who watch my videos are actually subscribed. So if you enjoy my content, consider subscribing. It's free and you can always change your mind later. Now let's move on with the video. Moving on to the next case. Joy Hibbs. On April 19, 1991, around 1 p.m., David Hibbs returned home from school, eager to share the news that he had made the honor roll. However, upon approaching his house in Corydon, Pennsylvania, he noticed smoke billowing from the windows. He rushed to the back kitchen door, but heavy smoke prevented him from entering. As he observed the scene, he noticed the gas stove burners were all lit, which led him to believe that his mother, Joy Hibbs, had been cooking and perhaps forgotten to turn off the stove. In panic, David called out for help, and his neighbors, who were working nearby, heard him. They attempted to enter the house to find Joy, but the fire was too intense. They immediately called the fire department. Despite their efforts to control the blaze with a garden hose, the fire continued to rage until firefighters arrived. After what seemed like an eternity, the fire was finally extinguished. Tragically, A paramedic informed 10-year-old David that his mother had not survived. Firefighters discovered Joy's body in David's bedroom, where she had been brutally assaulted. She had been so badly burned that she was unrecognizable. While the initial belief was that Joy had died in an accidental fire, an autopsy revealed a chilling truth. There was no sign that Joy had inhaled smoke, suggesting she had already been dead before the fire started. Further investigation uncovered that she had been violently attacked, strangled with wire cords, and stabbed 5 times in the chest and neck. The fire, it seemed, had been deliberately set to destroy evidence. This was a clever cover-up approach by the killer, given that the house had been completely destroyed from the fire, and that the neighbors had destroyed important evidence while attempting to put out the fire. According to the findings of the fire marshal's investigation, the fire originated from 4 different locations in the home, 2 in the kitchen, 1 in David's bedroom, and 1 in the corridor. According to the investigators, the morning of her death, Joy had cashed her paycheck. Her purse's contents were tossed on the living room floor, and the police found her wallet stuffed under the couch. The absence of evidence was compounded by the difficulty the investigators experienced in determining a motive. Joy was adored by all, worked part-time as a medical assistant, and was committed to her family. David Hibbs described his mother as graceful, polite, and easygoing. Authorities had no leads whatsoever as to the person who would want to kill her. On the day she was killed, Joy had dropped her 2 kids off at school in the morning. She received her paycheck, ran a few errands, and got home shortly after 11 o'clock in the morning. A church pastor and another member of the congregation dropped by for a visit shortly after she returned home. Joy Hibbs had indicated a desire to celebrate Easter in the church. Just before noon, the pastor and a member of the church departed the Hibbs family house. According to eyewitnesses, there was a dark blue Monte Carlo parked across the Hibbs yard shortly after the church pastor and his member left. The car was said to have remained there until 1 p.m. 2 days after Joy Hibbs' murder, former Bristol County Police Chief Tommy Mills, who was also a narcotics detective, reached out to the residence of Robert Francis Atkins in Falls, Pennsylvania. Robert lived about 2 hours away from where Joy Hibbs lived. Joy and her husband would occasionally buy tiny amounts of marijuana from Robert Atkins, who also appeared to have been their former neighbor. Robert resisted letting the detectives into his house. In the driveway, Detective Tommy Mills spotted a dark-colored Monte Carlo that matched a witness's description of a similar vehicle parked carelessly outside Joy's house shortly before the neighborhood heard the fire. However, during further investigation, the witness said Robert Atkins' automobile wasn't the one they saw. Robert Atkins was invited to undergo a polygraph by the investigators, but he refused, explaining that he had damaged his arm and that his lawyer had instructed him to wait since the nerve damage would affect the polygraph results. He further disclosed that he was camping at the Poconos with his family, friends, and co-workers when Joy's murder took place. Detectives soon verified his alibi. Robert confirmed that he bought a little marijuana for the Hibbs, but he wasn't a dealer. In the weeks preceding his mother's murder, David Hibbs overheard her arguing with Robert Atkins on the phone over the most recent purchase of a baggie of marijuana. Because the baggie was packed with stems and seeds, Joy demanded her money back from Robert. When asked by the police, Robert confirmed these arguments. He, however, stated that he had informed Joy that he couldn't refund her the money. According to him, it was simply improper. Investigators couldn't understand how a few tiny baggies of marijuana could cause someone to die. The couple was only spending $20 to $40 on marijuana at a time, not enough to get the attention of major sellers. On April 27, 1991, a co-worker of April Atkins, the wife of Robert Atkins, came forward to say that on the day Joy Hibbs was murdered, she had called the Atkins residence between 1 p.m. and 1:30 p.m., and Robert Atkins had picked up the call. On hearing this, the police now thought Joy's murder took place between 11:50 and 12:50. The police turned their attention to Joy's private life after determining that Robert Atkins' alibi appeared to be flawless. They questioned Joy's relatives and friends and found nothing unusual. Except for the person who had killed Joy, no one seemed to harbor any wicked intentions for her. Robert Atkins was still a person of interest in the case despite having an alibi though. 23 years after Joy was brutally murdered, a new Bristol Township detective, Michael Slaughter, was assigned the cold case in April 2014. Detective Slaughter made the decision to visit April Atkins, who claimed that she had never been questioned by authorities regarding the death of Joy Hibbs. She, however, clung to the narrative that her family was on vacation in the Poconos that weekend and hadn't learned of Joy's murder until they returned. A few days later, Detective Slaughter re-interrogated Robert Atkins regarding his movements at the time of Joy's death. He supported his wife's account of going camping and revealed to Slaughter that he had been a secret narcotics informant in 1991, doing drug deals and then reporting them to the police. During an interview with Slaughter in May 2014, a co-worker of Joy claimed that on the Monday before she was killed, a man called Joy at work and threatened to kill her. The co-worker decided not to report the call to the police because Joy's husband was now the focus of the investigation at the time. 2 years later, in September 2016, April Atkins, who is now divorced, traveled to the Bristol Township Police Station in order to provide a taped statement regarding her ex-husband's whereabouts during the murder of Joy Hibbs. Detective Slaughter was informed by April that Robert Atkins had returned home covered in blood after allegedly stabbing someone and setting their home on fire. He then instructed her to gather the children, take a few days off work and travel to the Poconos in the north. Out of anxiety and fear, April remained silent. That day, Robert Atkins took a shower after washing his blood-stained clothing. April Atkins didn't learn about the murder of Joy Hibbs until after her family returned from a trip to the Poconos. Despite the revelation, the case remained inactive for another 5 years. That was until November 2021, when Bucks County Detective David Hanks tracked down a former co-worker of April Atkins from 1991. Initially, the co-worker denied knowing April. However, when subpoenaed by the district attorney to testify before a grand jury about a phone call she had made to the Atkins household, the co-worker changed her story. The call had been answered by Robert Atkins, who was supposed to be camping in the Poconos at the time. In the following month, Detective Hanks managed to record a conversation between Robert Atkins and his ex-wife, April. This conversation led Robert to believe that April had informed her roommate about his involvement in Joy Hibbs' murder, which caused his anger and anxiety to escalate. Further damning testimony came from Robert's son, who in April 2022 testified that his father had confessed to him in December that he expected to be arrested soon for something that had happened many years ago. Robert had mentioned a woman dying in a fire before later revealing that she had been stabbed. After 31 years of evading justice, Robert Atkins was arrested in May 2022. He is currently being held at the Bucks County Correctional Facility, facing multiple charges, including first-degree and second-degree murder, 7 counts of arson, 2 counts of robbery, and 7 counts of first-degree arson, all related to the tragic death of Joy Hibbs. Moving on to the next case. Melissa Patton. Melissa Patton was born on September 9, 1977, to Carl and Norma Patton. Raised just outside Atlanta, Georgia, she shared a strong bond with her older sister, Tina. Melissa's vibrant personality left an impression on everyone she met. She was often described as bubbly, kind, and trusting. After graduating high school, she married her longtime boyfriend, Christopher Wolfenbarger, and the couple moved to another part of Atlanta to start their life together. Their marriage was blessed with 2 children, a son named Joey and a daughter named Chrissy. Melissa embraced her role as a wife and mother, thriving in her dedication to her family. The last time Melissa's parents heard from her was on Thanksgiving Day in 1998, during a phone call from Christopher's grandparents' house. She spoke about plans for Christmas, leaving her family with no indication that anything was wrong. However, when Melissa failed to show up for the holiday and missed her mother's birthday in February 1999, her parents' concern turned to alarm. Determined to find answers, Norma traveled to Melissa's home but was met with unsettling news from the neighbors. The Wolfenbargers had abruptly moved away shortly after Christmas, leaving no information about where they had gone. To make matters worse, Christopher never filed a missing person report for Melissa, nor did he inform her family of her disappearance. Given his documented history of domestic violence against Melissa, his silence and failure to contact her family only deepened their fears and suspicions. For Norma, Christopher's actions or lack thereof raised chilling questions about what had really happened to her daughter. On April 29, 1999, a gruesome discovery was made in a wooded area along Avon Avenue near Hartford Avenue. Inside a garbage bag discarded in a dumpster was the severed and bleached head of a woman. Just over a month later, on June 3, more dismembered remains belonging to the same woman were found. These remains, carefully packed in black trash bags and discarded in another dumpster, were missing the torso. Investigators noted that the dismemberment appeared to have been done with a saw, suggesting a methodical and brutal disposal of the body. The locations where the remains were found raised particular interest among investigators. They were alarmingly close to a glass company, where Christopher Wolfenbarger, Melissa's husband, had been employed in the late 1990s. This connection was more than a coincidence. Christopher had been dismissed from this company after being suspected of stealing a reciprocal saw, a tool potentially used in the dismemberment of the body, along with the proximity of the dump sites to Christopher's former workplace and his history of theft, added a chilling dimension to the investigation. As authorities delved further, the pieces began to form a disturbing picture. The meticulous dismemberment and bleaching of the head suggested a perpetrator who possessed both the tools and the expertise to execute such a horrific act. While the remains had not yet been positively identified, their location near Christopher's previous workplace and the brutal nature of the crime cast a heavy shadow of suspicion over him. In 2003, the case of Melissa Patton's disappearance took a shocking turn when authorities confirmed the dismembered remains as hers through advanced DNA testing. This breakthrough was made possible by a DNA sample from her father, Carl Patton, who had recently been arrested for a series of unrelated crimes. While the identification brought grim closure to Melissa's family, it also revealed a sinister chapter in Carl's history. Between 1973 and 1977, Carl had been responsible for the murders of 5 individuals across Georgia, including 3 victims from the infamous Flint River slayings. These long unsolved cases, which had puzzled investigators for decades, were finally linked to Carl through DNA evidence, uncovering the dark truth of his past. As the investigation deepened, Carl pleaded guilty to 4 of these cases in March 2003, and the 5th in May of the same year. His confessions led to a life sentence without the possibility of parole, sealing his fate behind bars and bringing some measure of justice for his victims. Initially, the revelation of Carl's brutal past led investigators to suspect him in the disappearance and slaying of his own daughter, Melissa. However, further scrutiny and evidence established that Carl had been incarcerated well before Melissa vanished, effectively eliminating him as a suspect in her case. This development was both a relief and a new source of anguish for the Patton family, as it meant that the true perpetrator remained at large. With Carl cleared of any involvement, the focus of the investigation shifted back to Christopher Wolfenbarger, Melissa's estranged husband. Despite the red flags, law enforcement struggled to gather the concrete evidence necessary to press charges against him, leaving Christopher as the sole suspect without formal accusations. In 2024, the police, determined to bring closure to the cold case, re-examined the evidence with fresh eyes and new forensic techniques. These developments finally pointed decisively towards Christopher Wolfenbarger, Melissa's estranged husband, as the prime suspect in her slaying. On a hot summer day in August, law enforcement moved swiftly to apprehend Christopher at his home in Griffin, Georgia. The arrest itself was as bizarre as it was telling. Christopher was found desperately trying to evade capture by hiding behind a dryer in his residence. This attempt to conceal himself only reinforced the suspicion that he had something to hide. The officers wasted no time in taking him into custody, marking a pivotal moment in the long and painful journey toward justice for Melissa. On August 6, 2024, Christopher was formally charged with taking the life of Melissa. At the press conference, Detective Shepard, who took over the case several years ago, said Christopher had been a person of interest from the beginning. And that probable cause is how they were able to finally make the arrest. When asked what specifically linked Christopher to the slaying, he said, "I want to protect the integrity of the case going forward, so I cannot disclose certain evidence. But we look at everything when it comes to a cold case." For her family, the arrest brought a bittersweet sense of vindication. The man they had long suspected was finally being held accountable. But it also meant revisiting the trauma of their loss. Norma Patton, Melissa's mother, said, "We have finally made it. He is in custody. And now we just need to get over the last hurdle and get him convicted. You may never know what final moment pushed him to commit such a horrific act. Only he holds the true answers." Melissa's last words to her daughter were, "I love you, and you know where I am if you need me." Reflecting on the tragedy, Melissa's mother, Norma, shared her thoughts about her serial killer husband and his reaction to Melissa's death. "He was devastated when he learned her life had been taken," she said. "But the moment he heard Chris had been arrested, he was deliriously happy." Tina, Melissa's sister, echoed the family's certainty about who was responsible. "From day one, we knew it was Christopher. There was never any doubt in our minds," she stated. Tina also recalled her mother's early perception of Christopher. "My mom said when she first met him, there was just evil in his eyes. That is so true," she said. "For Melissa, she didn't deserve what happened to her. And I hope anyone who finds themselves in a domestic violence situation, please get out." Moving on to the next case. The Grimmer family. January 12, 1970, was meant to be a typical day for the Grimmer family. Originally from Bristol, England, they had made the life-altering choice to move to Australia 2 years earlier. They had settled in Illawarra, New South Wales, at the Fairy Meadow Migrant Hostel, where the family consisted of 26-year-old Carol, 24-year-old Vince, 7-year-old Ricky, 5-year-old Stephen, 4-year-old Paul, and 3-year-old Cheryl. On January 12th, the Grimmers planned a visit to the nearby Fairy Meadow Beach. The only family member missing from the trip was Vince, who was working as a combat engineer for the Australian Army and couldn't join them. While the children played under the warm summer sun, the weather suddenly changed in the afternoon around 2 p.m., as winds picked up, shifting direction and blowing sand everywhere. At this point, Carol decided it was time to leave and started gathering their things. She instructed the children to wash off together in the shower block before they headed home. However, 10 minutes later, Ricky, the oldest child, approached his mother and explained that 3-year-old Cheryl was refusing to leave the shower block. Carol quickly followed Ricky back to the showers but found Cheryl was no longer there. Growing increasingly worried, the mother of 4 ran to a nearby house and asked the residents to call the police. Around this time, witnesses reported seeing a man carrying a girl they believed to be Cheryl. They recalled him holding the toddler up to drink from a water fountain before fleeing the scene, with Cheryl wrapped in a towel. It's now believed that the witnesses may have been mistaken in their recollection. Ricky later told police that he had picked up his younger sister so she could drink from the fountain. It's thought that the witnesses had seen this but mistook Ricky for an older man. Other reports at the time mentioned seeing Cheryl in a white car. New South Wales police arrived quickly, and the disappearance of the toddler triggered an extensive search. After 24 hours, authorities had formulated 4 theories regarding Cheryl's possible whereabouts. When announcing their findings to the press, the police shared that they believed there were several possibilities. Cheryl could have hidden herself somewhere and fallen asleep. She might have wandered into the ocean and been swept away. She could have fallen into a waterway. Or she might have been taken by someone with malicious intent. Another 24 hours passed without any trace of the missing 3-year-old. Given the extensive search efforts, if Cheryl had experienced an accident, or simply hidden herself, she would likely have been found by now. The absence of any sign of her led investigators to rule out the first 3 theories. Cheryl's disappearance was now being treated as a potential crime. Someone had taken her, and the challenge was now to figure out who. With several leads in hand, the police began their investigation into the individual responsible for Cheryl's abduction. Among the leads they pursued was a reported sighting of a blue Volkswagen Type 2 near the beach around the time of the disappearance. 3 days after Cheryl went missing, the police received a ransom letter, which they believed to be legitimate. The note writer demanded that they be given $10,000 in exchange for Cheryl's safe return. They noted that the 3-year-old was currently unharmed. Investigators got to work setting up a drop in the Wollongong suburb of Bulli, placing officers dressed as council workers nearby. The money was dropped off, but the letter writer never collected the cash. It was initially feared that the large-scale police operation and the carefully placed undercover officers had spooked the perpetrator. But as the letter writer never made contact with the authorities again, it was assumed that the ransom demand was a hoax. By 1971, had still not been found, and the police had established 3 main suspects in the case, although none could be definitively identified as the man witnesses had seen on the day of the disappearance. 15 months after Cheryl went missing, a local teenager handed himself over to New South Wales police. The 17-year-old from Victoria claimed that he had abducted and taken the life of the toddler. He reportedly gave an overview of the events on Jan. The teenager provided a detailed description of the area where Cheryl was allegedly buried, mentioning tubular steel gates, a cattle guard, a track, and a small creek, which were all close to where her body was supposedly found. According to an article in the Illawarra Mercury, several pieces of information the teenager provided were specific details about the crime that only the person responsible could have known. He accurately described the blue swimsuit Cheryl was wearing on the day she disappeared, along with the white towel she had with her. The teenager also outlined the route he had taken from the beach to the Balgownie area, where he claimed to have buried her body. He even took detectives to the location, although it was under development for housing at the time. He allegedly told the police, "I think this is it, but it's all changed." However, when the police interviewed the property owner, his description was contradicted. The owner pointed out that the cattle guard had been installed recently, and it had not been there at the time of Cheryl's disappearance. He also noted that there had never been a tubular gate in the area. The discrepancies in the teenager's account led investigators to conclude that his confession was likely false. A police report written by Detective Sergeant Philip Finley stated that, without material evidence directly linking the teenager to the missing child, it would not be appropriate to take any further action at that time. Despite the efforts of police, which included several public appeals and the offering of a $5,000 reward, no trace of Cheryl Grimmer was ever found, and her case began to grow cold. Her family in the meantime decided to move back to the UK. The tragic story of their daughter's disappearance was nationwide and a public spectacle, and they struggled to live normally in Australia as they no longer had the anonymity they once did. For years, Cheryl's case lay dormant. The past, and then came the all without progress on the case. It wasn't until that the case began to receive some media attention again when New South Wales Police Minister Mike Gallagher stated that while it was possible the 3-year-old and the culprit were both dead at this point, he hoped that someone might know the truth and might come forward with that information. He also speculated that the little girl had been alive for the last several decades without knowing her true identity. He encouraged anyone with questions about their past who may suspect they are the Grimmer's daughter to come forward. In February 8, January 2000, such woman came forward, but a DNA test proved she was not the missing toddler. In February, a coroner formally ruled that Cheryl was deceased, having passed away shortly after her disappearance. The cause of death was noted as being undetermined, and the coroner recommended that the New South Wales Police reopen the investigation. Cheryl Grimmer noted her belief that her daughter was still alive, stating, "It's not just a mother's hope, it's a knowing." Taking on board the coroner's advice, the police put forward a $100,000 reward for information regarding the case. Afterwards, Wollongong detectives and the Homicide Squad's Unsolved Homicide team combined into a new task force called Strike Force Wessel. In 2016, a review of the evidence was carried out. Every detail was put into the police computer system for the first time, and fresh eyes on the case revealed that many leads had not been thoroughly followed by investigators back in 1970. Felt that the 1971 confession in particular had been dismissed too easily. Armed with this information, they made their way back to the property where the 17-year-old had claimed to have carried out the murder. Here, detectives questioned the landowner's son, who in fact contradicted everything his father had stated previously. He claimed that the cattle guard was certainly in place and that the tubular gate had been there too. There was also a track leading to a creek on the land. All of these details had been mentioned by the 17-year-old in his original statement. It is unclear why the property owner countered all of these claims in 1971. Later that year, it was revealed that 3 witnesses from 1970 had come forward after they recalled seeing a male teenager loitering around the shower block where Cheryl had gone missing. The police also announced they had a credible lead on a man who was spotted with a fair-haired child in his arms at the time of the disappearance. The man would be in his 60s, and they asked him to come forward. And began examining the Mount Penang training school for boys. They believed that their prime suspect had spent time attending the reformatory school during the indicated that they had been provided with this information by someone who believed the former staff or students would be able to shed light on their inquiry. Then it appeared that the case had finally been cracked. The police announced on March 23 that a man had been arrested in Frankston, a suburb of Melbourne, at 1 p.m. on that he was currently being extradited from Victoria. The individual, whose name has been kept out of the public, was charged at Wollongong Police Station with Cheryl's abduction and subsequent murder, and then imprisoned at the Silverwater Correctional Complex. Investigators noted that it was unlikely Cheryl's body would ever be recovered due to the fact that much development had occurred over the years since her death. 1 month later, the police announced that they were trying to trace a family who gave a witness statement on the day of the abduction. Shortly after the toddler went missing, the family moved to Papua New Guinea, then back to their native Nottinghamshire in England. Interpol assisted in tracing the family, and they were eventually located. Their testimonies were believed to be highly important in the court case. Yet another month passed, and in May 0, it was revealed that the suspect in custody was the same person who as a 17-year-old had confessed to the slayings back in 1971. At the time, his admittance had been dismissed due to inconsistencies, but investigators had now dispelled those inconsistencies. The accused was currently 63 years old but was around 16 at the time of the murder, making him a minor. It is for this reason his name has never been disclosed. The individual had been born in the UK like Cheryl and had moved to Australia during this time. More information about the man's confession was revealed, and it was chillingly noted that he had told doctors in 1970 that he had urges to kill himself and kill other people. In his 1971 admission, the suspect claimed that he'd hidden with Cheryl in a nearby drain for about 35 minutes after he had taken her. He gagged her with a handkerchief and tied her hands behind her back. Emerging from the drain, he walked around 1.8 miles with the toddler to Balgony. According to the case prosecutor, the suspect intended on sexually assaulting Cheryl, although the 63-year-old would later deny this claim, labeling it as, quote, bullshit. In his confession, he told the police that he had removed the gag from Cheryl's mouth but that she'd started to scream and ignored him when he told her to shut up. He quickly put his hands around her neck and strangled her to death in a bid to get her to be quiet. Afterwards, he panicked, removed her clothes, and placed bushes and dirt over her body before he returned to Fairy Meadow Beach. Later the suspect sought bail. Prosecutors were opposed to this, claiming he was a flight risk as he was not an Australian citizen and still possessed a British passport. The prosecution noted the evidence against the 63-year-old was strong, stating he said that he'd been staying at the time in a Sydney hostel and caught the train to Fairy Meadow that morning and hung out at the beach. He then provided significant details in relation to the circumstances surrounding the disappearance of Cheryl, details of which are confirmed by eyewitness accounts, and details which the prosecution says could only be known to the offender. Meanwhile, the suspect's lawyer, Laura Fennell, said that it would be argued at trial that her client was significantly mentally unwell at the time of his 1971 confession, rendering his admittance inadmissible. She added that the case was already troublingly weak and that he had also admitted to the slaying of a prison guard, but this was found to be untrue. Ultimately, Magistrate Michael Stoddard refused bail, stating, "In my interview, on the face of it, there's a strong case against the accused in relation to the charge of murder." He noted that there were no bail conditions that could lessen the risk he posed if he was released. The suspect appeared at the Supreme Court of New South Wales on September 7, 2018 via video link. He confirmed his name, entered a not guilty plea and said nothing further. His trial was due to begin on Friday, February 15, 2019, however, a judge ruled that a key part of the prosecution's case could not be used as evidence in the trial. The evidence being the suspect's 1971 confession. The admittance couldn't be used as the suspect was a minor at the time and did not have an adult representative present during the police interview. And even though this wasn't legally necessary in the rule that the interview should be excluded on the basis of unfairness. He also referenced testimony from psychologists who'd reviewed the case for trial and noted that the 63-year-old had low intellect and would be more vulnerable to influence at the time. As this evidence was crucial to the case, the prosecution felt they were unable to continue forward. The man was released and his case has remained dormant since. Cheryl and Vince Grimmer passed away shortly after the case was reopened but Cheryl's brothers, Ricky and Steven, have expressed their surprise and distress at the outcome of recent events. Ricky Nash told reporters, "We're just a bit numb, a bit shocked. No words can describe how I feel at the moment." In 2016, Steven Grimmer shared his deep sense of loss, saying, "My mom and dad have passed on not knowing, and we want to know too before we pass on." Ricky, the eldest of the Grimmer brothers, seems to have been most affected by Cheryl's disappearance, revealing, "The decisions I made on the day were wrong. It's been with me all my life. I just want it over with. I shouldn't have left." He added, "Everyone says it's not your fault. Come and stand where I'm standing. See what it feels like." Ricky also expressed a desire to know where his sister's remains were, stating, "Give us something that we can go and mourn." Cheryl Jean Grimmer was last seen at the shower block on Fairy Meadow Beach, New South Wales, on January 12, 1970. At just 3 years old, she stood 3 feet tall, with blonde hair and blue eyes. A distinguishing feature of Cheryl was a navel that protruded 1 centimeter due to a medical condition. On the day of her disappearance, she was wearing a royal blue swimming suit with net paneling and carrying a white towel. A $1 million reward is currently being offered for information regarding her case. If you have any details, you can contact Crime Stoppers at 1-800-333-0000. Moving on to the next case. The Wonderland Gang. Barbara Richardson, Ron Launius, Roy Miller, and Benny Deverell, collectively known as the Wonderland Gang, were involved in small-scale theft and drug dealing during the late 1970s and early 1980s in Los Angeles County. Despite their modest criminal operations in cocaine and heroin, their illicit empire was abruptly shattered by an unsolved murder on July 1, 1981. The grisly killings, known as the 4 on the Floor murders, left the community and law enforcement searching for answers in a maze of conflicting evidence and unanswered questions. The case remains one of the most perplexing and chilling mysteries in the history of Los Angeles. At the center of the Wonderland Gang was Ronald Lee Launius, the leader of the group. Born in Sacramento, California in 1944, Ron was one of the last members of the silent generation in the western United States. In the late 1960s, he served in the Vietnam War, an experience that would have a lasting impact on his life and future choices. Ron Launius's time in the United States Air Force took a downward spiral when he became involved in the drug trade during his service in Vietnam. His role in smuggling heroin back into the United States, using the bodies of deceased soldiers as a cover for his illicit activity, eventually led to his dishonorable discharge. Upon returning to Sacramento, Ron's criminal behavior escalated, finding himself linked to 27 separate homicide investigations in the early 1970s. In 1971, Ron nearly faced a life sentence after being convicted of murdering a police informant. However, in a bizarre twist of fate, the prosecution's key witness was killed in an unrelated police shootout, allowing Ron to evade a harsh sentence. Over the next few years, he was frequently arrested for smaller crimes, including smuggling drugs across the U.S.-Mexico border. Despite these legal entanglements, Ron's presence in law enforcement's radar grew, as they noted his eerie calmness and calculating demeanor. Some law enforcement officers described him as one of the coldest, most methodical criminals they had encountered, while others wondered if his inevitable fate would involve an early death. Regardless of the opinions surrounding him, Ron's calculated and stoic nature remained undeniable, further cementing his reputation in both the criminal underworld and among authorities. David Lind, another member of the Wonderland Gang, once claimed that his pulse never exceeded 70 beats per minute, even when faced with a gun at his temple. Despite the notorious reputation and dark history surrounding him and the gang, Ron Lonius married Susan Murphy, the only surviving member of the gang from the scene of the infamous Laurel Canyon murders, in 1971. The second victim of the gang's downfall was William Billy Raymond Devereux, born on February 14, 1937. Billy was Ron's right-hand man and second in command of the Wonderland Gang. Raised in modest circumstances, Billy was drawn into the drug world, lured by the promise of easy money. During the day, he worked as an overhead crane operator, but by night, he became a skilled criminal, establishing himself as a rising figure on the streets. However, his descent into the criminal underworld took a heavy psychological toll on him. Billy was plagued by intense periods of depression, guilt, and self-loathing, often questioning his choices and wondering if he should leave his life of crime behind. Yet, under the influence of Ron Lonius, who took him under his wing, Billy chose to continue down the destructive path of drug dealing, further cementing his involvement in the Wonderland Gang's infamous activities. The third victim, Joy Audrey Goldmiller, was the leaseholder of the townhouse at 8763 Wonderland Avenue, which would later become known as the site of the murders. Joy came from a wealthy background as the ex-wife of a Beverly Hills lawyer and the mother of 2 children. However, her comfortable life crumbled, and she turned to heroin, eventually becoming consumed by the drug culture of 1970s California. Joy Audrey Goldmiller's involvement with the Wonderland Gang deepened over time, despite her declining health due to breast cancer. She became deeply entrenched in her drug use, which took a toll on her physical and mental well-being. Even as her health faltered, Joy remained dedicated to the gang, to the point of signing the lease on the property that would soon become the crime scene. Her loyalty to the group would ultimately seal her fate as one of the victims of the tragic events that unfolded on July 1, 1981. The fourth and final victim of the massacre was Barbara Richardson, born on October 17, 1959. Though she was not an official member of the Wonderland Gang, Barbara was closely connected to them through her relationship with David Lind, a gang member and Aryan Brotherhood motorcyclist. Barbara and David had a tumultuous relationship, marked by heavy drug use and involvement in criminal activities. They both eventually became police informants, but their lives took a darker turn when they relocated to Los Angeles. They tried to reintegrate into the criminal underworld, hoping to become legitimate members of the Wonderland Gang. However, they never made it past initiation before their lives were tragically cut short. In the late 1970s, 5 unlikely criminals came together in Laurel Canyon, Los Angeles. Ron, Billy, David, Tracy, and Joy, each with their own troubled pasts, saw an opportunity in the booming cocaine trade. They were drawn to the riches promised by the illegal market and decided to carve out their own slice of the pie. Their decision to enter the world of drug dealing would eventually lead to their tragic and violent downfall in the summer of 1981. Together, they set up base camp at 876 Wonderland Avenue, known as the Wonderland Gang thereafter. Before the calendar flipped to 1980, however, the Wonderland Gang garnered their first and most infamous customer in John Holmes, a former porn star known for his body more than his character. By the time he found the gang, he was $1,000 poorer after spending his paper on drugs from the crazed crime lord himself, Eddie Nash. Over the next couple of years leading into the early 1980s, the Wonderland Gang is frequented by close associates, Susan Murphy and Barbara Richardson. Together, they became the Shameful Seven and make a reputation for themselves unlike Los Angeles has ever seen. By the spring of 1981, the Wonderland Gang's operation is pulling in serious cash, smooth sailing for the Shameful Seven with a lot of promise for the future. Their only headache was John Holmes, a leech at the 8763 Wonderland Avenue property. The gang doesn't mind him too much, using him as a petty errand hand and finding amusement in the former celebrity's crumbling social status. But his fatal effects are yet to take full force. As the heat of summer in Los Angeles in 1981 ratchets up, the gang starts to realize their potential with Holmes and his connections to Eddie Nash. Holmes agrees they should act on his dissolving relationships, and they begin plotting a hit on Nash's treasure trove of a mansion in Studio City, California. Their target: cocaine, heroin, drug paraphernalia, boatloads of cash and antique guns that once belonged to the gang. In the early morning hours of June 29, 1981, John Holmes ventures to Nash's mansion as if it was any normal day. He buys his usual order of crack cocaine, taking notes of the location of the desirable, but forgets to leave the patio door unlocked. Holmes returns later in the evening and successfully secures the door open for the planned robbery. When he goes back to the Wonderland base camp, he finds the gang high on heroin and waits for their recovery, drawing a map of the mansion for their heist. As late morning arrives on 29th, Holmes feels paranoid and that too much time has passed and goes back to Nash's mansion once more to solidify the unlocked patio door. Once Holmes returns, Ron, Billy, David and Tracy journey to Studio City to make the hit. Tracy McCourt stays put in the stolen Ford Granada as lookout man, while the other three enter the unlocked doors claiming to be the authorities. Nash's 8-pound 300 bodyguard, Gregory Dials, is first to approach the Wonderland trio, but is quickly overtaken and handcuffed. In the scuffle to detain Dials, one of the men's handguns misfires and hits Dials in the back. The noise of the gunshot wakes Eddie Nash from another room and he enters to find his muscle man handcuffed and his valuables under siege. It's not long before Nash realizes the severity of the situation and begs for mercy. He drops to his knees, pleased to be spared, and opens the safe containing most of the goods. The crew acts fast, hauling away their treasure and escapes Studio City with what would later be valued at $1 million worth of drugs, weapons and cash. In the afternoon of June 29, 1981, the Wonderland Gang returns to 8,763 to divide their haul amongst the members. However, they give lesser shares to Holmes and McCourt, lowballing their efforts and infuriating the two men. Nevertheless, Holmes takes some of the stolen jewelry and goes about his day. Over the next 24 hours, Eddie Nash swears his revenge on those who humiliated him and his personal legacy. He sends his goons out into the city of Los Angeles looking for possible suspects. One of his right-hand men spots Holmes strolling through Hollywood wearing a notable ring that belongs to Nash. The news spreads faster than fire, and Nash brings Holmes back to his estate for questioning. Confined and threatened, Holmes is forcefully interrogated until he spills the names of those responsible for the home invasion reportedly witnessed by Scott Thorson, one of Liberace's former lovers. What happens between this interview and the murders is unknown, but at around 3 a.m. on July 1, 1981, less than 2 days after the Nash Mansion robbery, a group of unidentified men enter the Wonderland Gang property in Laurel Canyon. They prowl from room to room targeting individual members one by one, wielding striated steel pipes meant for bludgeoning. The first hit is Barbara Richardson sleeping in the downstairs living room. The second hit is Roy sleeping in the rear downstairs bedroom. With him, his wife Susan, but the killers only severely injure her as she would later survive despite horrific brain trauma and a lacerated finger. The third and fourth hits are Joy Miller and Billy DeVorel in the upstairs bedroom. Joy on the bed and Billy in the corner. Between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m., that fateful morning, neighbors hear plenty of commotion coming from 8763, but figure the gang is throwing another party and ignore the noise. Little do they know, some of the most gruesome murders in Los Angeles history is taking place right under their nose on that otherwise innocent stretch of road on Wonderland Avenue, forever mystifying the rest of Laurel Canyon's concerned community, and Alley County in total. When dissecting the entire scene of the crime and the violent nature of the murders, it's quite a shock that no viable evidence was retrieved from 8763 Wonderland Avenue in the forensic analysis, except for a handprint belonging to John Holmes on the headboard of a bed. Because Holmes was a frequent guest of the gang, they couldn't directly link into the murders, and with the era in which the crimes were committed, DNA evidence had not entered the prosecution's sphere or scientific community in general. Thus, without physical or biological clues, investigators were scrambling for answers early on. One of their first orders of business was finding the surviving members of the gang who were in their eyes the most likely to have killed the 4 victims. David Lind, who had befriended Ron in prison years prior, was apprehended and provided the vital piece of information law enforcement needed, claiming to have been in a hotel room with a prostitute in the San Fernando Valley on the night of July 1st. David Lind explained he wasn't anywhere close to Laurel Canyon, instead, dealing drugs in a small covert unconnected deal. This led to a more official interrogation by authorities where they were able to coax more confessions from him. Linda eventually revealed the dead Wonderlanders had carried out a massive theft of Eddie Nash's mansion 48 hours before their demise with the help of John Holmes. While it didn't inform anyone's involvement in the murders, the police finally had a direction to take their investigation. It linked John Holmes to a multitude of crimes, and anything involving the short-tempered, frantic Eddie Nash had to be considered as something sinister. Without a doubt, had Linda not been in the valley on July 1st, and instead was just another victim of the Wonderland murders, his testimony wouldn't have given the proper lead to Nash, Holmes, the robbery, and ultimately, one of the most obvious arrests and shocking acquittals in a history of true crime murder mysteries. Without question, the overwhelmingly popular theory determining who committed the Wonderland murders revolved around Eddie Nash, Gregory Diles, and their goons. It doesn't take much common sense to connect the dots between robbing an unstable crime boss and the likelihood of revenge. After all, Scott Thorson did right years later. He witnessed Nash himself order a retaliation after Holmes coughed up the name to the Wonderland Gang. Not only that, but Los Angeles detectives Tom Lane and Robert Souza found over $1 million worth of cocaine in Nash's possession a week after the killings, along with specific artifacts that were rumored to have belonged to the Wonderland Avenue residents. Despite these discoveries, however, the LAPD first arrested John Holmes for the Laurel Canyon murders, charging him and him alone without any other suspects in March of 1982. This arrest sprouted from the discovery of a single handprint belonging to Holmes on the headboard from one of the Wonderland's bed frames. Surprisingly, the prosecution argued Holmes actually wasn't a lone wolf, that he was an accomplice in the murders, acting as a gatekeeper to the Wonderland building and let the hit men enter without notice. After a much scrutinized trial, Holmes was acquitted on June 26, 1982 for each count of murder. Some pertain the acquittal to the success of Holmes's 2 court-appointed lawyers who argued Holmes was a victim, threatened and scared into helping the true masterminds without much of a choice. The self-defense proposition swayed enough jurors to forego the circumstantial evidence, along with the fact that Holmes did not cooperate with police, law enforcement, or testify in court at all, for which he would later spend 110 days in jail for. Even Holmes's wife, Sharon Holmes, admitted she was suspicious of him as well. She had told reporters back in July of 1981 that Holmes had said he knew the men who were inside the Wonderland residence the night of the slayings and was at the house just before they happened. She also stated years after John Holmes died that the morning after July 1st, her husband had returned home with blood splattered on his clothes, yet he remained uninjured. This was never proved nor cross-referenced, and were the only details Sharon remarked upon, never assisting either the police or the prosecution. Unfortunately, John Holmes passed away in March of 1988 due to complications from AIDS, taking with him the truth he had regarding his involvement in both the Nash Mansion robbery and the subsequent murders. Holmes wasn't the only suspect to ever find himself in front of a judge and jury, though. In 1990, 9 years after the Wonderland incident, police were still stepping on the tail of Eddie Nash. They charged him with the conspiracy and planning of the murders of Barbara Richardson, Ron Launius, Roy Miller, and Billy Deverell, with his bodyguard, Gregory Diles, charged as a participant. The prosecution included Scott Thorson as a witness to testify against Nash and Diles, and seemed to have the 2 gangsters in a corner. But when it came to sentencing, the trial ended prematurely with a hung jury, the votes coming in at 11-1 for conviction. Nevertheless, the California courts kept at them and tried Nash and Diles again in 1991. This time the 2 suspects were acquitted of all charges and set free. It would be the last attempt by authorities to pin Gregory Diles, as he died from liver failure in 1997. His personal accounts of the morning of July 1, 1981 still unknown. In 1996, both local and federal authorities joined together and held a 4-year investigation into the totality of Eddie Nash's suspected crimes. At the turn of the millennia, the task force arrested and indicted Nash under the Rat-Shear-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act for money laundering, drug trafficking, conspiring to murder the Wonderland Gang, and even bribing the holdout on the first jury of the 1990 court case. During arraignment in September of 2001, Nash agreed to a plea deal, most likely due to his age and deteriorating health. Thus, Eddie Nash pleaded guilty to the juror of bribing and the money laundering charges, but never admitted to the murder conspiracy. Rather, Nash stated he sent his associates, including Gregory Diles, to the Wonderland residence only to collect his stolen items, to which he concluded there was a possibility of violence without confirming anything. Nash paid up a $250,000 fine, spent 4 years in prison, and lived the rest of his life in silence regarding the events of that bloody summer in 1981. He died 2 decades later on August 9, 2014. Once Eddie Nash passed away, it removed the last known major player in both the LAPD and the general public's agreed-upon theory regarding who committed the Wonderland murders. But because all 3 were acquitted, no physical evidence was ever presented and their testimonies went to the grave. The killing's still technically unsolved with no justice imminent, and while it's highly improbable, there's a chance Nash, Diles, or Holmes never actually killed the gang. Even if Holmes gave up the gang's cover as the previous heist thieves and Nash sent Diles and the goons to reclaim his property, it doesn't automatically mean they committed murder despite the overwhelming circumstantial events. In fact, there are large groups of interested minds who look at the missing members of the Wonderland Gang who escaped misfortune and weren't at the residence on July 1st. David Lind and Tracy McCourt were both serendipitously absent from Wonderland Avenue when their peers were bludgeoned to death, and some wonder if it may not have been so accidental. Linda was in fact the person who gave authorities their biggest lead in John Holmes, going as far as to admit the gang had robbed Eddie Nash days prior. Despite Linda's own personal involvement with the heist, he still snitched the police seemingly to save his own skin. However, it's worth considering if Linda himself tipped Eddie Nash the Wonderland Gang's involvement, coming away with both the riches from his share of the Nash Mansion hit and the gang's empire after their death. Or Linda killed the other members himself with the same outcome in mind, using the Nash heist as a scapegoat. It would give law enforcement a believable suspect to pin the murders on and leave Linda to escape untouched. Or maybe the police knew Linda was guilty, but still went after Holmes and Nash in exchange for Linda's cooperation in other investigations. It was a known rumor in the years after the slayings that David Linda became a police informant in Southern California. Gossip so strong, his position in the criminal underworld became controversial with rival gang members who dismissed his credibility in general. Because confidential informant records are not kept nor discussed publicly, Lynn's greatest role in an applicable conspiracy is unknowable, as he passed away from an overdose in November of 1995. Tracy McCourt could have a similar motivation to offing the other Wonderland Gang members. He was frequently teased, called Titmouse Tracy by David Linda even, and left out in bigger gang dealings. For the Eddie Nash invasion, McCourt was originally supposed to be part of the robbery, but after his handgun was taken away by Linda, he was given no other choice but to be the lookout driver. Some circles of amateur sleuths believe McCourt was then given less of a share due to his lesser role and subsequently angered as a result both the short-changing and long-term disrespect. Thus, McCourt could have quickly organized a hit against the gang, staying home the night he knew the terrors would come down. Of course, if it were true, he would have failed overall as his biggest transgressor. David Lind ended up living through the entire ordeal. Yet maybe that could have pushed McCourt away from the Los Angeles life of crime in the end, as he moved to Colorado afterwards and wound up in and out of prison for assault and trafficking charges. Much like Linda, we'll never know if McCourt indeed had a role in his friend's demise, as he passed away without known cause in October of 2006. Before we divulge our hypothesis, We want to make known our conclusions are purely logical speculation based on evidence, circumstantial and factual subtext. We are only privy to the same information presented in each video, and we do not attempt to promise certainty or an expert guarantee on the findings we reach in closing. We simply observe, research, and report. Whether you believe in the far-fetched conspiracies or the nearly clear-cut conclusions to Laurel Canyon murders, one thing is certain: whoever slaughtered the Wonderland Gang did so with a vengeance and intent on causing more than harm, but also a suffering demise unlike most people had ever seen. Based on the gruesome crime scene and medical examination post-mortem, it's obvious there was an intent to unleash evil. This was no accidental manslaughter or carefree homicide. This was revenge served in the coldest of blood. The tragic events surrounding the Wonderland Gang remain a haunting chapter in Los Angeles' criminal history. While Eddie Nash and Gregory Dials were acquitted of direct involvement in the brutal murders, they undeniably played significant roles in the larger network that contributed to the bloodshed. With their extensive resources and influence, they had the means and the motivation to orchestrate such a violent act. However, it's believed that neither Nash nor Dials physically carried out the murders. Instead, they likely commanded a group of unknown associates who executed the crime. Dials may have played a motivating role in the violent retribution, though his own injuries, having been shot less than 2 days prior, suggest he was not directly involved in the killings. As for John Holmes, his involvement is murkier. While he most certainly had access to the Wonderland residence and was likely present the night of the murders, it's unclear whether he had any direct involvement in the killings. His role, if any, seems to be more about granting access than actively participating in the violence. The true nature of his complicity remains an open question. But the biggest mystery of all, the true identities of the perpetrators, may never be answered. The men who committed these horrific acts, and those who orchestrated them, took their secrets to their graves. Nash, Dials, and Holmes all left behind a shroud of mystery that has yet to be lifted. The victims, Barbara Richardson, Ron Launius, Roy Miller, and Billy DeVarale, are the names that will be remembered. Despite their dark pasts, they did not deserve the gruesome end they met on that fateful night of July 1, 1981, at 8763 Wonderland Avenue. The violence that unfolded in Laurel Canyon that night will remain a chilling reminder of the dangerous world that existed behind the veil of Los Angeles' criminal underworld. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed exploring these intriguing cold cases with me. If you found the video fascinating, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to Cold Case Mystique for more deep dives into unsolved mysteries. Your support helps me bring you more compelling content. Leave a comment below with your thoughts or any cases you'd like me to cover next. See you in the next video, and remember, the search for truth never stops.